هيا للصلاة هيا للصلاة هيا للفلاح هيا للفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. With recent events in our country, particularly in Ferguson and other places, the issue of race relations and racism in the United States has become a subject of great interest. And there are a lot of debates happening, many of which unfortunately are creating further polarization and misunderstandings. But still the issue of race has come to the forefront. And Islam has given very clear teachings that for the most part we are aware of how Islam teaches equality. However, in the context of this debate, which many of us as individuals may be involved in, we perhaps have our own opinions and perhaps even very strong opinions on the subject. But there is another question which is more difficult, but perhaps more important for us to answer. It is easy to point the finger at someone else and label that person as being a racist, or to look down on another person's actions as being something that is clearly above what we would stoop to. However, to look deep within ourselves and see if there is a vestige of arrogance, of racism that exists within ourselves, that is something that is difficult. But from a tarbiyati point of view, that is an important question that we should ask ourselves. And it is an important question that has to be addressed in order for us to achieve spiritual reformation. Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Rabi rahimahullah ta'ala gave a sermon on this subject during one of his visits to the United States. And he began with verses of the Holy Quran that relate the story of Hazrat Nuh and his people, and described how that applies to a great extent to the Jamaat here in the United States. The history of the United States Jamaat is something that we are generally familiar with, which is that Hazrat Mufti Muhammad Sadiq Raziyallahu Anhu came and invited people to Ahmadiyyat, and those who primarily joined were African Americans. And even in our history, if we go back 40 or 50 years, the majority were African Americans. Then after that, there was a great influx of immigration from South Asia. And so there's always been these sort of two categories, these two primary groups within the Ahmadiyya Muslim community of the United States. And this has to an extent played a part in our history and played a part in us as individuals. Hazrat Khalifa Rabi rahimahullah ta'ala read chapter 11 and verse 28 to 32 of the Holy Quran, the translation of which is about the story of Hazrat Nuh, that the chiefs of his people who disbelieved replied, "We see you to be nothing but a mortal like ourselves, and we see that no one has followed you but those who, to all outward appearance, are the meanest of us, and we do not see in you any superiority over us. No, we believe you to be liars. As Abdullah said, that, O my people, tell me if I stand on a dear proof from my Lord, and He has bestowed upon me from Himself a great mercy, which has remained obscure to you, how will it fare with you? Shall we force it upon you while you are averse to it? And O my people, I do not ask of you any wealth in return for it. My reward is only with Allah, and I am not going to drive away those who believe. They shall certainly meet their Lord. But I see that you all are ignorant people. And O my people, who would help me against Allah if I were to drive them away? Will you not take heed? And I do not say to you, I possess the treasures of Allah, nor do I know the unseen, nor do I say I am an angel, nor do I say concerning those whose eyes despise, Allah will not bestow any good upon them. Allah knows best whatever is in their minds. Surely in that case I should be of the unjust. Now about these verses, Hazrat Khalifa Rabi said that these verses from the Holy Quran which I have just recited do not merely narrate an ancient historical episode, but along with other Quranic verses and historical evidence, are meant to describe a permanently established psychological phenomenon. Time and again, conditions of Noah's era are repeated, and every time, human response to them remains the same. Now, Hazrat Khalifa Rabi describes that there is a phenomenon that happens when a people become materialistic, which is that they start to look down on those people who have less material means than them. And as a result of that, a sort of class distinction takes place. Now here in the United States, since there is a history of slavery, of discrimination, and of segregation, so that class divide has taken the form of racial divide as well, where African Americans are generally the poorer members of society, and white Americans are generally more affluent and rich. This is a detail that has not gone unnoticed to the people who have come here, to the people who are a part of the society. And in fact, it is our reaction, the reaction of some people to this reality, that has caused problems to arise in the American society and to a small extent within the Jamaat as well. Huzur says that the fact of the matter is that immigrant Pakistanis who have settled here are victims of a type of complex, namely the inferiority complex. In fact, this inferiority complex has nothing to do with the shade of your color, may it be pure black or lesser black. This complex develops due to narrowness of heart and mind. Narrowness of heart and mind of a person, regardless of his color, always expresses itself in a feeling of inferiority. Many ills of human society grow out of this complex, but the consequences are devastating if people become its victim in the realm of religion. Now, when a person begins to define his self-worth by materialism, then it is inevitable that he starts to look down on himself because of his lack of affluence, because of his aspirations. In many societies, there is discrimination, not just in the United States, but in other places as well, even in South Asia, even in India. Those who are of darker skin are discriminated against or looked down upon as compared to those who are of lighter skin. Now here, if somebody comes to the United States and they see that those who are African American are generally in the poorer sections of society, and those who are white Americans are generally in the richer, more wealthier sections of society, then if a person is defining his self-worth by his materialism, then he will definitely start to look at lighter skinned people as being superior and darker skinned people as being inferior. And that complex is because of that materialism. He will define his own value and his self-worth by the wealth that he has. And if he is poor, he will look down on himself. There will be a self-loathing that exists within himself. Now, that person will start to project that self-loathing onto those other people who are poor, who are poorer than himself. And so this is where a type of racism starts to come forward. If a person admires wealth, then he will look at people who are wealthier than him in those subsections of society as being superior. And he will look up to them. And he will see them as being superior. He will want to aspire to them and be like them. He will try and dress like them. He will try and act like them. He will try and speak like them. And in those sections that he looks upon as being poorer than him, he will look down upon them. And then he will try and avoid mixing with them. He will not like that his children associate with them, that he speak like them, that he act like them. And this creates a type of bias. Huzur said that, however, at times it may be temporary. For example, immigrants from various countries, they may feel that they are financially better off as compared to the African Americans, and further may feel that their color is lighter. Thus, unconsciously, they tend to become a part of the social setup of the whites, by making closer relationships with the whites, they may feel a kind of superiority over others. Huzur says that in my opinion, this is not a consciously developed attitude. In most cases, for if it was a conscious effort, they would not remain true Ahmadis. They would immediately become untrue and faithless because they would contradict the Holy Quran's fundamental teachings. Now, when this materialism exists, when this distance from spirituality exists, then it is inevitable that it creates divides within community. It is inevitable that it creates a divide within hearts as well, wherein the progress of the community is hindered. Huzur says that we have to look deep within ourselves to see if this exists on an individual level as well, and try to create that reformation. As I said, that when we look at the events happening in the country, when we look at Ferguson and other places, it is easy to point the finger at a distance and say those are the people that are creating problems, those are the people who are prejudiced and who are doing something wrong. But the difficult thing is to point the finger within ourselves and to see to what extent that prejudice may exist on a subtle level within ourselves. This is a lesson that we are taught in the Holy Quran as well. Allah Ta'ala tells us the stories of the disbelievers and the grave mistakes that they made. But it is not just to feel sorry for them or to look down on them, but it is to do istighfar, that perhaps even the most subtle aspects of those same mistakes they make may not begin to manifest themselves in us. Because a person does not become evil or a disbeliever overnight. It happens step by step and little by little. Huzur says that this type of discrimination that may exist, it does not happen outright. It does not happen on the surface where a person sees it plain and simple. It's not that we start to close the doors of our mosques to those who are poorer than us, to those who are darker skinned, to whatever category of people it is that because of materialism a person may look down on. He says, how can the doors of religion be closed to those who are honored by God? If they strive to grow in righteousness and to offer greater sacrifices, they cannot be stopped because of their color, their nationality, or their financial standing. These doors are not closed outwardly, but the hearts are locked. Attitude is changed. They are being perceived unkindly. Instead of embracing them with love, they are kept at a distance. A curtain is drawn. Obviously, no one ever saw that doors of any mosque were physically closed to any Ahmadi who came from these people. His entrance was never forbidden. Nevertheless, if you really search your hearts, Huzur says that it is possible that you may find that unfortunately you had locked your soul's door to them, or if you had not locked it completely, you had at least half closed it to them. You did not desire to keep it wide open, so that they could gladly enter into it. Huzur says that due to this attitude, Jamaat Ahmadiyya suffered a tremendous loss beyond your imagination. What a truthful statement Hazrat Noah alayhi salam made when he said that if I drive them away, this would be such a great sin in God's sight that none among you would be able to help me when Allah's decree would be enforced. So here Hazrat Rabi has described that this type of sin that comes into a person, this outright racism that we are seeing in certain parts of our society here in the United States, it is not something that enters into us overnight. It is not something that being a part of our society completely influences and changes us in this environment overnight. But it is something that slowly starts to enter into a person. And there is a need to constantly be vigilant in looking towards that. Is it possible that we or an individual fail to mix with those in a loving way who are of darker skin? Is it possible that we ourselves look down upon those who are poorer than us, who are in a different part of society, who lived in the wrong neighborhood, or belong to the wrong subsection of society in our hearts? If that is the case, then that is a type of subtle discrimination that Huzur says has done a great deal of damage to the progress of the Jamaat. Huzur said that it is unfortunate that some, due to their own sick mentality, feel themselves superior over servants of God who are less privileged, and treat them with arrogance. You may not be one of the insolent, yet you did not exhibit the desired love and affection to them. Huzur says that if that love had been exhibited, which was shown by the Prophet ﷺ to the downtrodden of his society, then the history of the Jamaat of the United States would be very different. And the progress of the Jamaat would have been on a completely different level. Huzur goes on to say that this is linked with a type of arrogance that would exist within us, and that arrogance must be guarded against. He said that have a greater fear of arrogance than you fear a ferocious lion. There is nothing deadlier than insolence. It creeps in imperceptibly through concealed openings and overpowers you in entirety. And more often, the preachers of humility and claimants of meekness are themselves a prey to arrogance. So here Huzur describes that no one should consider themselves above this, not myself or anyone. A person who considers himself humble, a person who preaches humility, may often be a victim to that same type of arrogance. It is a very subtle thing that creeps into a person's soul and slowly starts to have an effect on that individual. After this, Huzur addresses not just the immigrant Ahmadis, but also the African American Ahmadis as well. And he describes that this inferiority complex that exists among some of the immigrant Ahmadis also exists among some of the African Americans as well. And this is a consistent phenomenon that is seen among various different types of people. It is something that we can all relate to. Huzur relates a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ which describes the mentality of people who have been suppressed for a long period of time in society, and how it is displeasing in the sight of Allah Almighty when we develop that complex. Huzur says that there was no one greater who understood human nature than the Prophet ﷺ, because he did not look at people according to their race or their status, but he looked at people from the sight of Allah Almighty. And so because of that, seeing people as purely as a creation of Allah Almighty, he had a better understanding of that human nature. Now in one hadith, Huzur says that once he said that among those disliked by God are those among the poor who despite their poverty are arrogant. This explains, Huzur says, what inferiority complex really means. The poor who are being despised by others, if they respond with pride and arrogance, then this is because of their inferiority complex, for they begin to retaliate by looking down upon others. This sort of complex is something that exists among all oppressed people. It applies to the African Americans in the United States, and it also applies to the South Asians under the colonization of Britain and of Europe. It applies to any people who exist under the authority of others. The fact is that when a person defines his value, his self-worth by materialism, then he begins to look down upon himself because of his poorness, because of his status. Now, when a people are suppressed by a superior people, by a more affluent people in society, when a people are subjugated and they can't find a way out of that subjugation, when they're stuck in that poverty, and they continue to have a materialistic mentality, then they are trapped in this inferiority complex where they can't help but look down on themselves. They loathe themselves, their socioeconomic status, the parts of the neighborhoods that they are forced to live in, the people they are forced to interact with. They aspire towards wanting to live and interact with people who look down on them and who have forever closed the doors of progress to them. And so being stuck in this condition for a long period of time, they begin to develop an arrogance in their poverty. That for no logical reason whatsoever, they start to walk around with arrogance in their demeanor, in their speech, in their attitude. It is a defense mechanism. It is a reaction to a painful inadequacy that they feel within themselves. And it is a result of materialism. Islam teaches to define our self-worth by spirituality, by our love for Allah Almighty. So long as a person has materialism within himself, this inadequacy will exist within them. And this will become a problem that becomes a hindrance in their journey towards Allah Almighty. This does not apply only to those who are African American here in the United States, but it applies to all people who have been subjugated in the history of the world. Even in South Asia, India was colonized by the British. And at that time it was white people who were the colonizers. And during that period of time, people of that subcontinent had had a materialistic mindset that started to develop an inferiority complex. Those who are materialistic, those who aspire to become more rich and wealthy, they look down on themselves and their own culture, the color of their own skin. They would try and dress like the British, act like them, speak like them. They look down upon themselves, and they aspired to something that was beyond what they could have. And when they were in that position, whenever someone is in that position, they have a very heightened awareness of how their colonizers are looking at them. They are very aware of the subjugation that they are under. And so at that time, even those who lived in India were very aware if the colonizers, the white people at that time, looked down on them. If they saw them as being trivial people, if they saw them as being irrelevant people, people who belonged to a lower society than themselves, who were poorer and less educated and of less value. This is something that the people who were who have immigrated from that subcontinent here to the United States experienced themselves, or at least our forefathers experienced over there. The same thing that many African Americans are experiencing in this country as well. So it is a very circular process. It is not something that anyone is immune to. And so then from that perspective, we can appreciate how those who are darker skinned, whether it is in this country or in any other country, are very sensitive to the way that they are treated. Those who are in India, they were very aware if a white person looked down onto them. In the same way, those who are African Americans, when they are treated poorly by white people, by Pakistanis, by Indians, by Arabs, by people of any country, and they are very aware of how they are being treated. If subjugated people are good at nothing else, and they are good at being highly sensitive to the superiority complex with which they are dealt with by their subjugators, by people who are in a higher socioeconomic status than they are. And so this is why feelings of love and brotherhood are so important within a religious community, within a divine community. And this is why that spiritual reformation is so important. It doesn't matter if we greet somebody with a smile, if we are polite to someone. If there is even a small vestige of racism that exists within a person's heart, if behind their back we speak of them in a derogatory way, if we generalize about their entire race, about their entire people, then whether we are polite to them in their presence or not, on one level or another, they will be aware of that contempt that exists within our hearts for them. They will be aware of what is actually happening within our thoughts by our demeanor and our body language and by our facial expressions. And so, when we see these different events happening in the United States, when the issue of racism is brought to the headlines and is brought to the forefront, the easy reaction for us to have is to point the finger at those people who we perceive as being racist. Those people who are wrong, those people who are clearly doing something that is unjust and something in the lowness that we would never stoop to. But what is difficult is to see and to examine ourselves. And this very subtle examination, this very minute examination to see what vestige of racism exists within us is necessary for the progress of the community. Because so long as any materialism exists within us, then we will develop an arrogance within our hearts based on the material possessions that Allah Ta'ala has given us. And so long as we live within this country of the United States, where to a great extent a certain race of people is more affluent and another race of people is less affluent, then it will be very difficult for us as individuals to have that materialism and that arrogance within our hearts and to avoid a subtle form of racism that grows within our hearts unconsciously without understanding it. And so these events bring to light that need for self-reformation within ourselves. And that mentality that destroys the love within the community and that takes away the progress that Islam and Ahmadiyyat is seeking to make in the United States. Hazrat Khutbah al-Masih Ta'ala said that it is because of this type of mentality that a great deal of harm was done to the Jamaat here in the United States. In that when Hazrat Mufti Muhammad Sadiq came, the people who accepted Ahmadiyyat were primarily African American. And it was because they were in search of truth and in search of guidance. They came with sincerity because there was a light within themselves. In the same way, when the promised Messiah came, he came among people who were considered inferior. There were not very many people of the colonizers of that country who accepted, but it was people who were desperate and in need of guidance and light. The same thing applies to the Prophet ﷺ. The Arabs at that time were considered the lowest in society, but they were the ones who had light within their hearts and they accepted Islam and they brought about that revolution of the world. And so if at that time we begin to reject those people who have that light within our hearts and look down on them, then an irreparable harm is done to the Jamaat and its progress. And as Hazrat Nuh said, that if I reject those people, then who will help me when the decree of Allah Ta'ala comes? And so the progress of Ahmadiyyat does not just depend on preaching, but it depends on the brotherhood that we have within ourselves, on the love that we have within ourselves. And so the way that we can bring about this reformation is an examination of our hearts, not affectations of love, not exaggerated expressions of politeness going forward, but from a simple and pure analysis of our hearts and the removing of any arrogance and prejudice that exists. Once that prejudice is removed, then those against whom we may have shown some prejudice before, they will naturally begin to perceive the love that exists within our hearts. And it will create that brotherhood and spread Ahmadiyyat and spread and consolidate the foundations of the Jamaat here in the United States. So with these subject of racism brought up in the United States, this is a point of tarbiyat that we can take away from it. And this is how we can make it a means of self-reformation, not only within ourselves as individuals, but within our circles, within our families, within our discussions at our dinner tables, within our group of friends when no one else is looking, when no one else is watching, to bring forward this aspect of love and brotherhood that our Jamaat is so desperately in need of. May Allah Almighty strengthen us, and may He take away these exceptional cases that exist. As the people have said, that this is not something that happens intentionally, and also this is not something that, God forbid, is so widespread, but even a small amount of some kind of lack of love, of prejudice that exists can do a great harm to a community that is so dependent on spirituality as the Ahmadiyya Jamaat is. May Allah Almighty create this love within our hearts. الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. There are a few announcements. Waqf Jadid here is ending on December 31st. A letter was mailed to all members stating their outstanding balance due. Please pay your balance as soon as possible. All young boys and girls are to participate in Nanha Mujahid and Nahi Mujahid scheme by paying $50 from their pocket money. All parents, please help them in this regard. And there is a request for prayer. The mother of Harun and Mamoon Rashid Sahib is critically ill in an intensive care unit. All members are requested to pray for a full and speedy recovery. Similarly, Sahibzada Dai Latif Sahib, Abdul Sami Jidran Sahib, Mansoor Khan Sahib and Sister Asari Chaudhry Sahiba are also not feeling well. Please remember them in your prayers. We will observe Janaza Ghaib of two individuals after Jumma. Usman Chaudhry Sahib of Central Virginia requests Janaza Ghaib of his maternal grandmother Hafiza Begum Sahiba, who passed away in Pakistan last week. She was mother of Bushra Chaudhry Sahiba and of North Virginia Jamaat and grandmother of Usman and Farhan Chaudhry Sahib. Also, Nasir Jidran Sahib of North Virginia Jamaat requests Janaza Ghaib for his uncle Hamidullah Khan Sahib, who passed away in Pakistan a couple of days ago. He was 84 years of age, and despite being old and sick, he was very much active. He is buried in Bahishti Maqbara in Rabwa. He was grandson of Hazrat Maulana Rahim Baksh Sahib, an early companion of the promised Messiah. And also, there is an announcement. Hibi Iqbal Sahib of Central Virginia, Alhamdulillah, was blessed with a son, Zaid Ahmed Iqbal, born on December 18th. Please pray that he grows to be a true servant of Islam and Nabiyyat and Khilafat. So there are sweets available afterwards. There is also an announcement from the Finance Department that everyone is requested to submit their budgets by the 19th of December. And so this is important so that the Finance Department can make their plans for the coming year. Also, there's one final announcement which is about Salat centers, that by the end of this year, by the end of December, the Tarbiyat department is trying to revive the Salat centers that were established last year. So our local Jamaat is also making a push for this. So when you are contacted for joining a Salat center or coming to observe congregational prayers in your Salat center, please take that opportunity to be able to observe some congregational prayer at a convenient location near your homes. عباد الله رحمكم الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون اذكروا الله يذكركم وادعوه يستجب لكم ولذكر الله أكبر